Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Next to Madison. I am very excited for today's episode, as I am for all my episodes, but today in particular, I am sitting down with a New York Times best-selling author who is here to talk about his new book, which just hit shelves on April 7th. And it's just a very amazing, touching story. It's very real. And it's something that we're going to get a behind the scenes look today about this book. And then we'll also, towards the end, talk about his other books and a Netflix film that just came out that was very, very well done based on a book that he wrote as well. So with that being said, I would like to bring on my guest, Robert Kolker. How are you?
Hi, Madison. I'm doing okay. I hope you are too.
Yeah.
The show.
Yeah, of course. I'm so excited you're here. So the new book is Hidden Valley Road. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Sure. About 4 years ago, I was introduced to two sisters who were both in their 50s. And they were the youngest of 12 children in their family. They had 10 older brothers. So of the 12 kids, they told me that six of their brothers had acute mental illness, were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And that was just the beginning of their story. There was abuse, there was a murder-suicide, any number of horrors all took place growing up. And the more I listened, the more I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that all of this could happen in just one family. And I wondered how they could even remain a family after all that. But as the two sisters spoke to me, what I learned was that the family was together, that they were all still in touch, and that they had sort of come through all of that tragedy and found some meaning from it. And one thing that they had to report was that their family was scientifically significant, that it wasn't just a fluke that there was so much schizophrenia in their family, that since the 1980s, two different research teams had been studying the family's DNA, and each of them had come up with new insights into schizophrenia based on the study of this family and other families with lots of schizophrenia in them as well. And so what they were proposing was, and this was the most interesting part to me, they said that they wanted to write their own story about the family for a long time, for decades even, but that finally they realized that they were just a small part of a much larger story about 12 siblings, about two parents, and also about schizophrenia in general and the science. And they decided that it would be better to ask an independent author and journalist like me to take the story wherever it led him or her, to investigate the family's history, to look into medical records, to interview everyone and get everyone's perspective, and to interview the scientific researchers and get at the root of what the family's scientific contribution was. There were a lot of unsolved mysteries in this family, and as I learned, there were a lot of family secrets as well. And so they were ready to let somebody go ahead and do that. Now, as you can imagine, I was a little skeptical listening to this because I thought, well, they have a lot of brothers. There's got to be at least one brother who would stand up and say, I don't want this to happen. I object to this. Mm-hmm. And above everything else, there are medical privacy laws in this country, and people can keep their medical information private. So really all it would have taken was one person in the family to stand up and say no, and then there would have been a lot of difficulty. So I decided to take it very slowly, and I spoke one by one with each surviving member of the Galvin family, that's their name, the Galvins, starting with the sisters, but then the mother, Mimi, who was in her early 90s, she is since deceased. And then I interviewed all of the other brothers who were still alive. There are 3 who are deceased, but there are, let's do the math. There are 9 children left with 2 sisters. There are 7 brothers left. And so I spoke to them all on the phone. I kind of did it slowly. Like once a week, I would spend an hour on the phone with each Galvin family member. And I would say, so your sisters are interested in having a book written about your family. What do you think about that? And just to feel them out. And what I told the sisters was that we would all know one way or another, a few months down the line, whether this was feasible or not. And sure enough, it was. And that was really exciting for me because suddenly here was a chance to tell a nonfiction story about a family from every family member's point of view, and a chance to research the very mysterious illness of schizophrenia and see how our understanding of it has changed since the time of the Galvin's, peak period of mental illness.
Right.
It,
So
it was really irresistible.
yeah, I know, absolutely. It's an unbelievable story. And I guess I should let the audience know that I am also related to this family. So
That's
it's a personal story as well. All these children are actually my father's cousins, and Mimi is my grandmother's sister. So I want you to talk about
interviewed your grandmother actually on the phone a couple of times. She
oh,
was wonderful. Yeah, really nice.
yeah, which is so much fun. But you did such a good job really taking the story and kind of moving it along, the timeline. So the stories where you talked about Mimi, those all came from her, how she met, how she grew up, how she was taken from this very wealthy family, which I think you really described her very well in the book. Let's talk about the mom and her character and kind of just what happened to her of being erected from a wealthy family to basically going back to nothing or having nothing.
Well, what I quickly learned about Mimi in the few times that I talked to her was that she really took a lot of pleasure in telling old stories about her family, not just her childhood, but her mother's childhood, and about her grandfather, who both grandfathers actually, who were real beloved figures to her. She had sort of a golden Garden of Eden kind of period early in life in Houston, in Texas. And then when there was a family scandal, her mother remarried and moved to New York. And then in the telling of her stories, she had a second golden age of her childhood where she was romping around the city with her younger sister, with your grandmother, and enjoying New York and really having what she would call the best education of a lifetime. And she liked telling these stories, in my opinion, because it made her feel good to feel as if she was a part of something special. And what happened in her life was that she married a very special guy, her husband Don, but then Don's career took them to a place that she never would have imagined going to before, which is Colorado Springs, way out west, back when that town was not, before the Air Force Academy made that a tremendous place to be. It was a backwater to her, and she was distressed and she was isolated. And she had to sort of make up for what she felt was lost, I think, in my opinion. She had lost her family pedigree and never finished college because she got married. And so I think it was important to her to sort of roll out her bona fides to everybody whenever she, talked to them.
Yeah.
And then she had a lot of children, and perhaps that was part of it too. To be very distinctive by having 12 children might have been part of the solution to her problem.
Yeah, and I remember growing up with her. She was always fun. It was always fun to see Mimi. But she always had a story. It was always like if you were going to Cancun, somebody else was going to Hawaii, but you really can understand growing up the way she did that she did want to relive those good memories because she really was kind of living her own tragedy, although there was a lot of joy as well. So it's interesting how our childhood experiences really can kind of shape how we become.
Yeah, and she used the stories later when tragedy struck as almost as a reservoir of positive energy, to try to stay cheerful and not be heartbroken every day. That was her big saying, apparently, was you can't be heartbroken every day. And so she would lean on some of those stories later on to sort of get her through the day. And now you could be critical and say, well, perhaps she was in denial, but on the other hand, she was the one who kept the family together, by having blinders on and really pushing forward that way.
Absolutely. And most parents, I mean, luckily they'll never have to deal with this, but you don't know how you're going to be until you're in that situation.
Right.
And, she did do a good job, and she was a very caring mother. But the story continues. So I'm going to have you kind of take it from here.
Well, the children of Don and Mimi, the 12 children, they span the baby boom, which is a nice, convenient thing for storytelling purposes. I mean, the oldest one's born in 1945 and the youngest in 1965. And so the younger ones come up in the 1950s and are off to college by the mid 60s. And then the younger ones are teenagers just as the 60s is really getting rolling along. And there's the counterculture and drugs and rock and roll. And through all this, Don and Mimi really both reveled in being a model family to those around them. Uh, they, they had their pictures in the paper a lot. Her recipes once were in the paper. They fancied themselves really an example to be followed. But what was happening behind closed doors was different. That starting with the oldest son, Donald, he really outwardly was the golden child. He was a star football player, a star wrestler. He dated the general's daughter at the Air Force Academy. He had everything going for him, but there was something sort of keeping him at bay. There was like a barrier between him and the rest of the world. He was really quite troubled, and those troubles really increased in late adolescence. By the middle of college, he was torturing a cat at college. He ran into a bonfire. He started to really have psychotic breaks. And that's when he first started interacting with the mental health system. And that's when Don and Mimi, the parents, really started to worry, not just about their son, but about the rest of their family. And this is where the broader story of mental illness in America really takes root, because Donald and I guess the second child, Jim, were becoming acutely mentally ill at a moment in time where most psychotherapists would blame the parents for mental illness. We're the same way that with autism, they said they would, refrigerator mothers were blamed. In psychiatry for schizophrenia, there was something called schizophrenogenic mother. It was a theory that parents would, or particularly mothers, would send double messages to their children and rope-a-dope them in such a way that they would then have to create their own realities in order to cope, which seems sort of erroneous and silly today. But these therapists were doing battle with other people who wanted to do things like lobotomies and electroshock therapy. And they were also doing battle with eugenicists who wanted to sterilize people, so they felt they were treating the patients as human beings, and that they thought they were really on the side of the angels. But really, unfortunately, the byproduct of this is that people like Don and Mimi would never, ever own up to having mentally ill children, because it would mean the entire family would be scandalized. There'd be a terrible stigma. They would be blamed. And so they went shopping for the right medical opinion to keep Donald in college and to keep him going, until finally they had no choice but for him to start going to the state institution. And in the end, all 6 of the sick Galvin boys, had real, acute medical treatment, most of them in and out of that same institution in Pueblo.
Yeah, right. And there's a lot of, the book is very emotional. There is a lot of stories that are heartbreaking, that are just, particularly about the girls. How did you get through writing what started to happen to the girls? Like from an emotional standpoint, because it was very deep.
Well, the one reason why I think everyone in the family cooperated and participated in this book is because they recognized that the girls really got the worst of it. That the bad things that happened in the family either happened directly to the girls or trickled down, and the trauma from it affected the girls. And because they stayed in the family the longest time. They stayed at home the longest time. And so they deferred to the girls. They said, well, if the sisters want this book made, then we'll let it happen. That's all right. And so my first step really was to interview both Margaret and Lindsay extensively, to really get their life stories separately, almost as if I was writing a biography of each one of them, and to make those sort of the two legs of a stool, of a three-legged stool, and then the third leg would be to bring in the rest of the family, and then there'd be a fourth and a fifth and a sixth and a seventh leg. But
Right.
bad metaphor. But at any rate, you get them to, as they would be my jumping off point. They would be the prism through which I would see the family most, and then of course I would weave in perspectives from everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I saw there were two women who essentially, had parallel experiences as small children, in the same family with the same traumas, the same difficulties, the same abuse by Jim, the older brother who regularly abused them. It wasn't identical because they were different people, but it was very similar. And yet over time, they process those traumas differently. They deal with those traumas differently. And each of them, for very good reasons, like it's not that one is right and one is wrong, but what it offers the reader, I hope, is a chance to see two different ways of processing and making it through and coping with similarly horrible circumstances. I know my eyes were open watching to see how Lindsay would respond to something differently from how Margaret would have, and vice versa, and how the two of them really needed each other for a very long time to help one another through it.
Right. And it's just, was it an emotional experience for you writing some of this? Because you really go in detail. There was moments where I read the book and it's so well done, where I had to put it down because I was just like, I cannot believe that this happened to them. Because my experience with Margaret and Lindsay was, life was great. Everything's great. They're beautiful. They've got beautiful families. They're successful. You just never would know that their childhood was, had so much sexual abuse.
Yes, they both are very, perhaps they learned this from their mother, but they both are good when at not necessarily revealing everything going on beneath the surface at every moment.
Yeah.
Not to say that they're dissembling or anything like that, but it's just a manner, a way to sort of manage the world and not be a raw nerve all the time. Sometimes I think I had it easy because it was my job. Like, it's not like I was being nosy. It was, they wanted me to do it. They'd been sitting on this information for so long, for so many years, that it was like the pressure had been building up, and finally they got a chance to talk. So part of my job was to sit and listen as they told everything that was on their minds. And then my job got a little more complicated because I would be assembling everything in chronological order and trying to make sure that it all made sense. And then I would start asking questions to fill in the gaps. And suddenly they, and everyone else in the book too, would start being asked to think of things that they hadn't really thought of in a very long time, and to fill in those blanks. And that's when some of the other more powerful stories in the book really started to bubble up. So it starts out as them trotting out the stories that they've been rehearsing in their heads, and then it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. You just keep going back. I think I took 8 trips to Colorado and all, talking to different people.
Wow. And I know you, as you said, you spoke to Mimi when she was still alive. Did you talk to her about her knowing that the girls were sexually abused by one of her own children and how that impacted her? Or was that a conversation you just had with the girls primarily?
It was primarily with the girls. I would bring, Mimi was in her early 90s and was a natural, had a lifetime's practice of deflecting unpleasant conversations. So with the sisters' help, she was able to talk about the shame she felt at the time that the family was first having its troubles. And she was able to talk about feeling unsafe in the house with Donald there, and one time Jim attacking her and her, coming away alive and being very frightened. The sexual abuse, the most she would talk about with Jim is to try to answer the question why, if she and her husband knew that Jim was mentally unstable, did they allow their daughters to go stay with him on the weekends? And she she was offering up defenses for that. She would say, well, because he was getting better and because, was seeking treatment and everything seemed all right and you didn't want to be at home, so that they had a running conversation about that I witnessed some of as well.
Right. And the older girl, Margaret, when she was a teenager, she got to escape essentially and go to Denver and live with a very wealthy family called the Garys. Did you have a chance to talk to the Garys?
Yes, I spoke mainly with Nancy Gary, a little bit with Sam, but
Mm-hmm.
mainly with Nancy. I visited with her twice, and she's an extraordinary person, really. That just their family that's had their own share of tragedy, and yet they've taken in people, not just Margaret, but at least two other young people lived with them for a few years, and then extended family as well. They really have been benefactors to a lot of people who really needed the help. So you don't often hear about stories like that, and if those stories do happen, it's normally not the wealthy people who are interested in opening up and talking about it, for a book. But the pretext here, I think Nancy is so proud of both of these women now, of both of Margaret and of Lindsay, that she really wanted to get that across.
Yeah. So, okay. So that's great. So did she say when she took Margaret in, she knew how bad everything was at that point?
I think all she knew was that so many boys were becoming mentally ill, and that she had some training in psychology. I think she had gone back for a graduate degree,
Mm-hmm.
and her story, the way she tells it, is that Mimi was blaming it on the drinking water at the time. Like Mimi was, according to Nancy, was sort of rooting around, desperate to try and find some sort of reason why this was happening, and Nancy, as a response, was saying, you've got to get the girls out of there. I'll take Margaret. Send me Margaret, and maybe we'll send Lindsay to summer camp, but we'll do something. So she really felt like, but she didn't know about sexual abuse, and she didn't know about some of the other things that didn't come out till later. And but of course there was a murder suicide that she must have known about that happened in 1973. I'm jumping around a bit, but Brian, who was a widely adored son in the family, a talented rock and roll musician, was living in Sacramento, and one day killed his girlfriend and then himself. And it came out that he had been prescribed an antipsychotic, that he also was schizophrenic. So the tragedies just kept piling up.
Right. And it was, I don't know why we never Googled it when it came out, but like when I was growing up, this story was always Brian and his girlfriend were addicted to heroin, and because they couldn't get off heroin, they committed suicide together. That was the narrative.
I hadn't heard that one. I had heard about other ones, like a suicide pact of some sort, but not related to that. That's interesting.
Right. So it was almost a cover up.
I think what happens is it's 1973, so Lindsay was 8 years old and Margaret was 11, so they couldn't really be clued into the truth. They had to come up with some kind of cover story for them. And I'm sure the extended family got that cover story as well.
Right. It's because my dad, he was born in 1950. So growing up before mental health hit, I mean, these were his guy cousins. He had 10 of them to kind of play with. And they went back east to go camping, and it was the good memories, which in the book it was so well done, but a lot of the joy wasn't covered. Was there a reason it was left out?
It's interesting. I would get inklings of some of the good times. In fact, there's some snapshots from the 70s of a bunch of family members just going off on a hike together and smiling for pictures. And given all the tragedy in the family, I remember looking at those pictures going, wow, what a challenge this is going to be to make it clear that there were actually okay times. But I think, because narratives have to compress events, and the events are all the vivid things, it becomes more difficult.
Right.
But the book in general, it asks the question, why did the sisters stay part of this family? Why didn't everybody just up and leave? And I think that speaks for itself, the fact that they both stayed in Colorado, that they kept up ties, and that Lindsay in particular became the caretaker for the sick boys, despite being determined to leave. There is a pull back to this family that can only be explained by by love that exists there.
Right. And did you, since you talked to everybody that was alive, at the time, was there somebody that you felt you could relate to the most?
Um, I found both Lindsay and Margaret very relatable. I also liked Michael a lot,
Okay.
um, because of he's such an independent thinker and has such a neat way of looking at the world. Michael is, you would call him the hippie of the Galvin family.
Yeah.
And John, who lives out in Idaho and has since the early 70s, he interested me because I grew up in Maryland and I live in New York now, and I have for 25 years. And he would say things sometimes speaking from the perspective of somebody who had left home a long time ago and never come back. And I would relate to that as well. I mean, there's a bit of a yin yang for someone like that. Like on the one hand, you are the one who left, but on the other hand, you also feel a little rejected too, because you're no longer a part of what's going on there. And that to me that's a poignant thing that I think is true of a lot of people who leave home. You're the jilter, but sometimes you feel jilted.
Right.
So I appreciated that as well.
Yeah. And how was Richard? Richard's the family member I still see quite often. Richard's very grandiose, but he's just the sweetest guy, always happy. But he is referred to multiple times as a schemer.
Well, he's like a childhood schemer, and then after high school, I refer to him as the former schemer. But
Okay, good. We don't know what's coming.
He told this amazing story about it involved the door to the school commissary and a wad of chewing gum, right? Like, so he took the chewing gum and propped the door open, and so for the whole school year, the door was, unbeknownst to anyone, was open. And so he and his friends basically looted the commissary for a year, and that got him kicked out of Air Academy High School for a year. And so his dad, this is where it gets interesting, because his dad would then drive him to a different school every day on his way to work. And so he got very, very rare one-on-one time with his dad, after being expelled for a year from the school. And it wasn't necessarily comfortable, because his dad would be saying, you better not screw up. But still, it was kind of memorable for him. Imagine if you're one of 12 children, to have that kind of regular one-on-one time with a parent must be unique.
Right.
Yeah. So, but I completely agree with you about Richard. He's as sweet as can be,
Yeah.
and was as surprised as anyone to end up having a very warm and loving relationship with his mother later in life. I mean, he was one of the kids who felt like he was really under his mother's thumb growing up. He wanted to rebel just like anybody else, but that entirely seemed to turn on its head later on. And it's almost like he and his mom, along with his wife Renee, they became buddies, like pals who would just sort of hang out and gossip and talk. And I thought that was really sweet.
Right. And because there was 6 ill children and 6 well children, the well children, even though they didn't get this, tragic mental illness, it must have been very difficult for them to grow up and try to get their mother's attention. And you start to talk about that in the book. Can you explain a little more about that? Because if they were fine, the emotions had to be so suppressed. And how do you feel it's affected them in their older years?
I think the situation, as you said, it must have been extremely difficult when they were younger. You have, their father at a certain point became less of a player because he had health problems. So he was still around, but he wasn't really an active parent. He had a stroke and was recovered and couldn't work, but he was he was home, but not really the parent. So Mimi was the primary parent for a great deal of the time there. And she was determined to keep the sick boys close to her. And that sometimes meant, or often meant, neglecting the well ones. So that means, it's hard enough to individuate yourself in a family with 12 children, but imagine if you have a mother who every time you go up to her and say, I'm having trouble with this chemistry test, she says, you think you've got problems, I'm, just be glad you're not like your brother Donald, and so that's one problem. And then, as you said, the other problem is that you don't want to do anything abnormal because you don't want to send the message that you might be going insane too. And part of you might wonder if you are next, given that how many other siblings have lost their minds. And so first of all, you're worried you will go insane. Second of all, you're worried your parents will think you're insane. So crying about something minor, you would never think of doing in front of your parents because you'd be afraid that they would think that it was time to send you to Pueblo, to the doctor. And that was a very real fear that I think a lot of them felt. And even the ones who were out of the house already, like Richard, who was older, or John, who was older, they would wake up every day and think, well, it happened to me today. It happened to 6 of my brothers. Why wouldn't it happen to me? Very, very difficult situation. But the thing about Mimi is this. In the first part of the book, you might be tempted to think that she's really in error all the time, that she's just in denial and smoothing things over and neglecting these poor children and making terrible decisions. But then as everyone grows up and gets older and reevaluates their childhood, it's not just Richard who becomes closer to Mimi. Both sisters start to recognize some of the value in Mimi's decisions. And both sisters realize that Mimi had a lot going for her. And she starts as this is extreme, but she starts as sort of a villain and she ends as a hero, really, by the end of the book. And I think that surprised me as I was writing, and I appreciate now reading the finished product.
Yeah, I mean, everything was just so well done. But yeah, just imagine not being able to express your emotions. It shocks me now when I think about all my encounters with the children, how normal they are, given such an abnormal upbringing. But were you able to, how were your conversations with the children that are still alive, that are sick, and that are living in the homes? Can you tell us more about those?
Well, they're all very likable, first of all. And I mean, I think it's in keeping with the general understanding of this disease that once it's medicated and once you grow older, you tend to mellow a little bit. So at no point was I in a room with somebody with a straitjacket, or that there was never a feeling that it was unsafe or that somebody would suddenly become violent. They're mellow, nice people. They all are limited, some with cognition issues, and others physically they're a little stiff. They're fragile because of health problems. Many of the health problems come from taking these psychiatric medications for so long. But the most important lesson for me in speaking with them was just how the last thing I should do in this book is consider mental illness to be a uniform cookie cutter thing. It manifests differently with each person. They are different people with different mental illnesses. It wouldn't be enough in the book for me to say, and then he went crazy, just like his brother, and then move on to the next brother. I really wanted to get their experiences in there as well. Donald believes he's descended from an octopus, and he tells long stories about being the father of everyone in the family and having created everybody, and how his mother's his wife. And, there's all sorts of interesting stuff going on there listening to him talk, but he's very serene as he explains all of this. He's not trying to prove a point or anything. He's just like, oh yes, absolutely. And Matthew is not delusional, except in moments when he is perhaps stressed out, and then he'll start talking about saying things like, if I don't get what I want, if they don't let me do this, then there's gonna be another earthquake in Alaska, like the one that killed people 10 years ago. He'll get there, but most of the time particularly with medication, he's very much in the real world, and he's a little grouchy and irascible, but also very fragile and really needs not just actual real material help from his siblings, but also, love and attention. He really needs the attention. And Peter is really, he's a natural performer. He plays the recorder for everybody who comes to see him. He's in assisted living. He has the most cognition issues because he's had a lot of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy or shock therapy, and that hurts your memory. So he knows who everybody is, and he's able to talk about stories from his childhood, but he really isn't able to speak on a deep intellectual level anymore. But he's loving and affectionate and very eager to please.
The last time I saw them was Mimi was still alive, was Christmas of 2016. Like, we went up there a few days before to they were the grandchildren and the children were going to have Christmas for her. And so we were all up there, and Peter came in with the recorder, but his memory is very good. He immediately saw me and was like, "Hi, you're Tom's daughter, and you're the comedian, and you're doing this," and it was just very sweet, very normal, very just so happy, and he was so excited to play Christmas carols on the recorder, and I remember it being such a joy,
Yeah, and he played at Mimi's memorial service too. He played My Favorite Things. He really. He's a positive guy, a very positive guy.
I mean, and it's just, do you think it's just, I do find people that are sick or have disabilities, sometimes they don't totally understand what's wrong. So there is more joy. Did you find that a little bit with them? Meaning, like, they don't feel sorry for themselves. I never noticed that with them.
Yeah, the sisters would often tell me that Joseph, before he died, I never met Joseph, he was the only one who was really self-aware that he knew he was delusional, and that was actually very poignant to see, that he would say, there's somebody up in the sky talking to me, don't you see it? Like, and then he would say, I'm having another hallucination, and so that would get kind of sad, and he'd be very wistful about it. But you're right, the others aren't at that place, and so they're spared that, I think.
Right. And how do you think, what was it that with their genes, it was almost like it was a genetic time bomb? Because you talked to a lot of the doctors, and we'll go into that part next, but what was the gene that they think caused this?
Well, the problem with schizophrenia is that it's such a complex genetic illness that there is no single smoking gun gene. And that once the human genome was sequenced, they thought that they'd have this thing sewn up by dinner time, and they'd find the gene immediately. But what happened is they found one, and then another, and then another, and now they're far more than 100 genes they think are contributors to schizophrenia, and they all contribute such a tiny amount that it's basically a worthless exercise. But that doesn't mean that one family's illness isn't attributed to one particular issue. And that doesn't mean that one family can't be valuable for looking at how schizophrenia functions and to help you understand how it might work elsewhere, in terms of brain function for others. So the Galvins end up becoming really quite interesting for researchers, because they're almost like a petri dish that you can, with a closed sample set, that you can analyze. So one team has discovered a genetic irregularity that most of the family members have, that's on a gene called SHANK2, which is related to brain function. The theory there is that this genetic irregularity with the SHANK2 gene either acted alone or combined with something from the other side of the family. SHANK2 problem comes from it actually comes from Mimi's side of the family. And that perhaps it mingled with an issue on Don's side that hasn't been identified yet, and created the perfect storm, like a terrible cocktail that had terrible consequences. Or, but really, SHANK2 isn't something that everybody with schizophrenia has. However, it does point to this part of brain function that researchers can then look at to see if perhaps if they can do something that helps SHANK2, perhaps it's something that can help otherwise too. And there's lots of precedent for this. Yeah.
Were the other, so all the children that were alive were tested for this gene, and only the sick ones had this gene?
No, the family was tested in the mid 80s. So every living family member was tested was donated blood, and then the blood was analyzed and the genes were sequenced years later because the technology didn't exist back in the 80s. And what they found was that everybody who was tested had this genetic irregularity, sick and well. So the question becomes, does it create a vulnerability or a susceptibility toward developing schizophrenia that then becomes triggered by something in the environment later? And that's a very tantalizing idea. And
So all the children have this SHANK2?
I'd have to go back and check, but it's possible that one of the girls doesn't. But certainly every sick one does. Certainly every sick one does.
So what is was my grandmother ever tested?
That's a good question. Yes, she has the SHANK2 irregularity because that's how they know it comes from the mother's side of the family.
Okay, so she also has it.
Oh, your grandmother. No.
My grandmother.
Oh, no. She was never tested. No, Mimi was tested, but not your grandmother. Sorry.
So Mimi has had the SHANK2.
Yeah, exactly.
And Donald did not.
Right.
Interesting. So, and all the kids had it except for one girl?
I'd have to go back and look, but certainly all the sick ones had it, and perhaps one or two of the not sick ones.
So if somebody, let's just say somebody's listening to this and then goes to read the book, and they may say, well, how do I find out if I have this, and how do I prevent this happening to my future family? What is there any like hope in that for them?
Well, I think the takeaway from this whole SHANK2 situation is that SHANK2 is this family's particular problem, but it may never repeat itself with any other family. There are so many different neurons, brain cells, and so many different genes that play into brain function that another family with a lot of schizophrenia in it might have a totally different gene going haywire. So all it is really a road sign that points toward a part of the genetic code that perhaps you should pay attention to with other families. So there would be no reason to test for SHANK2 anywhere else, I don't think. Particularly since every month now they come up with new studies talking about other genes that play into other people. The Galvins, however, were part of other studies that led to a look at a gene called CHRNA7. CHRNA7 is very interesting because it's part of a brain receptor that can be that's all about responding to stimuli out in the world, helping you get a sense of bearings of where you are, and perhaps if that part of your brain is in trouble, then you could have delusions, you could have hallucinations, and so it makes a lot of sense that a lot of people, if not everyone with schizophrenia, would have a problem with this part of their brain. And that is amazing because now researchers think, well, what if you could strengthen brain development to make it less vulnerable to developing acute mental illnesses like schizophrenia? What if you could take that part of the brain and help it mature better than it would otherwise? What if you could give mothers a nutritional supplement, expectant mothers, so that their children in utero can have better brain health? And perhaps, and it's a big perhaps, you'd be helping a large part of the population protect themselves against developing psychosis. And this is happening right now. They're testing it. The substance that they are asking mothers to take is called choline. Mm-hmm. It's safe. You get it at the vitamin shop or at the GNC. And they're asking expectant mothers to take it the same way they would take a prenatal vitamin. And really, they hope one day that it could be as effective as a prenatal vitamin is. Prenatal vitamins have folic acid to help prevent cleft palate. what if schizophrenia could be prevented that way? And so the research that started with the Galvins might lead down the road to something that profound. And that to me is amazing.
I mean, that's unbelievable that their story is positively impacting future generations, which is just such a gift. So is this now something that OBGYNs will say, you need to be on this to every pregnant mother, or just mothers that potentially could be at risk?
The FDA has signed off on it. They said we now recommend. This was as of a couple of years ago, and it was directly out of Dr. Robert Friedman's research, and he met the family back in the 80s. And they issued a blanket recommendation saying, they did not say take this pill and you won't get schizophrenia. What they said is that brain health can be positively affected by taking choline supplements while expecting your baby, and that to me is kind of huge.
I mean, it's unbelievable that, because I'm trying to think, when did prenatal vitamins come on the market?
I don't know, but I do know that there have been other supplements that are supposed to help with brain health, because when my kids are now teenagers, but when they were little, they would market some baby formulas as having a particular substance in it that was supposed to help with brain health. An organic substance, but like they would add it to their formula, saying so then, as insecure parents, we would say, oh, well, if our kid's on formula, give them the one that'll help their brain, they'll go to Harvard. But and so when I learned that choline was being basically explained the same way, saying, well, it'll help with your brain development, I thought, well, interesting that there's already a precedent out there, that there are already things that people feed their children to help with this category.
Right, absolutely. And Donald, the father, had passed away quite some time ago. And I didn't realize towards the end of the book, the granddaughter talks about seeing the father's brain. So the father's brain was donated to science?
Yes, and nobody seems to know why just his and not the other deceased Galvin sons. Although obviously Brian's wouldn't have been, because it was back in 1973. But Joe and Jim died in the late 90s, early 2000s. So it would seem like a good idea to send their brains over to that lab as well. But apparently it didn't work out for them. But the father, yes, his brain went over there, and they didn't see any physical signs that correlated to what they traditionally see in brains of mentally ill people in his brain, which is interesting, although not conclusive of anything.
So do you think, I don't know if they determined anything with this, if Mimi had married somebody else, would this have still happened to her family?
Possibly not. That the one hypothesis is that it isn't just Shank 2 or Cherna 7 or something that Mimi had. It's something that mingled with something that Don had. And geneticists will tell you now that it's not a replicable recipe. Like let's say a man and a woman meet and they have one child, and those two bizarre irregularities meet. That child could have, let's say, schizophrenia. Then they have a second child, and those same exact irregularities could meet, and that next child could have bipolar disorder. Like it's not like it's a Rube Goldberg machine where you put it in one end and it comes out the other end. It's more random than that. So to me, that's fascinating.
Right, and I know they do genetic testing now, where they can take a couple and do blood work and make sure they don't have these irregularities. Was any of that brought up in your research for moving forward?
In theory, I guess you could do genetics counseling for this sort of thing, but the problem is that every family they say all unhappy families are different. Well, all schizophrenic families have different genetic issues. You could search high and low your whole life and not find another family with the Schenk-2 issue. It merely is a way to point out something happening in their brain in a certain spot in the brain.
Interesting. Okay. And how were the conversations that you had with the medical researchers?
Um, they were just fascinating. I mean, you have
Yeah.
someone like Robert Friedman whose career has taken so many twists and turns. I mean, it's been decades since he first met the Galvins, and he's hit several dead ends since then, but he keeps doubling back. It's like keeps backing the car up and trying to find out another way to do it until finally he's landed on choline, and suddenly it's huge. It taught me a lot about how science really works. I mean, I think most of us grow up thinking that science is a steady march of progress, forward, 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 and that diseases suddenly get cures overnight. Like Jonas Salk appears and says, "I have a vaccine for polio, and it's cured, and the problem is solved." But in fact, what I've learned is that with most illnesses, it all happens in fits and starts, and there are long arguments, and there are researchers who have tunnel vision and never consider the other researcher's point of view. And there's groupthink, where there are whole schools of thought that are so tied to one approach that they don't listen to the other approach. And then the breakthroughs happen in a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of way. And that's what I learned from Dr. Friedman and Dr. DeLisi. Dr. DeLisi was a pioneer who was assembling genetic data from families like the Galvins as early as 1984, but it took until 2016 for the blood work she did on the Galvins to yield real information. She waited a long time, but it happened.
Wow. And that must be such a great feeling for not only her, but for the family too, to know that there's a lot of hope. So
Mhm.
how do you think we've done a good job as society starting to strip away that stigma of mental illness? What would you say to the people today? What do you think we can do to progress that and really strip away that image?
Well, one thing I learned when working on this book is that I would talk to people who I thought I knew well, and I would tell them what I was working on, and they would suddenly tell me stories that they never told me before about a family member they had who had either schizophrenia or some other very severe mental health problem. It just underscored for me that we've come a long way, obviously, from the days of the schizophrenogenic mother, but still, it's not something people talk about. There still is a stigma. And I think whatever we can do to lift the stigma is important, because what we also know is that early intervention's very helpful for disorders like schizophrenia, that if you can prevent, either through therapy or medicine or a combination of the two, if you can prevent future psychotic breaks, then the person won't be as worse off. I mean, Peter Galvin had his first psychotic break when he was 14. If he had had a different kind of intervention at that time,
Hmm.
what if he didn't have another 27 psychotic breaks? What if he only had another 2 or 3 after that? He'd be a different person now. And so you have that sort of hope now. But really, I think the thing you asked what you take away from it. What you take away from it is that the understanding that the reason why we often don't talk about schizophrenia isn't just because it's a mysterious illness that's scary. It's because the people who have it quite often can't advocate for themselves. I mean, people with cancer can advocate for themselves, and uh, people with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's
Uh-huh.
do that. But severely mentally ill people historically have been sort of shunted aside and put in a different category, and we should resist that.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I just think this book is going to open so many people's eyes and start a conversation that might not have really been started in a lot of different families and among friend groups, and really kind of a new sense of compassion and empathy for this, and making sure people know that it's okay to say, "Hey, I'm struggling."
Yeah, I hope so, for sure.
So before we wrap up, this has been so great. And you guys, the book that we're talking about is called Hidden Valley Road. But we want to talk about your other book. You had another big hit. So we'll quickly talk about that, called Lost Girls.
Yes,
Uh,
that was my first book. I wrote it in 2013. It was about the Long Island serial killer case, which is still unsolved. And it was a look not just at the unsolved case and all the theories about the case, but it was a look at 5 of the women who were caught up in the investigation, who were victims in the case. And not just about the women, but about their families. And what really drew me into writing this book was to sort of answer the question of why one person growing up in a certain environment decides to become a sex worker on the internet and perhaps their sisters don't, or no one else on their street does it either. Why engage in such a high risk business, and what is it about that business that leads people to blame them when they go missing and not want to try and solve their murder? Because there was a lot of police apathy in this case. The police were saying things like there's a consolation that he's only going after prostitutes. And what I learned is that this is an issue in a lot of multiple murder cases. A lot of times the victims are just thought of as plot devices or as little widgets, and that they aren't actually thought of as people. And everybody focuses on the killer thinking that they are some sort of Hannibal Lecter master criminal, but really, in fact, it's easy for them to get away with it because they know that the women won't be missed. They know that the authorities won't care if they go missing. It's a problem as old as Jack the Ripper, really. The women there were forgotten women as well.
And how did you, the story is obviously a true story. It was in the newspaper. How did you come about writing this book? Did you contact the surviving family, like the parents, and say, hey?
I was on staff at New York Magazine, and we wanted to write about this case. I wanted an original angle because everyone else was waiting for the police to come through with a breakthrough in the case. And I met with one of the sisters of one of the victims, and I learned just how peculiar her situation was. On the one hand, she's glad for the attention, and on the other hand, she's wondering where the hell people were for the last 3 years when she was trying to get help because her sister was missing and nobody cared. Now it's part of a big serial killer case, and so suddenly everybody wants to know about her. And then she was upset because everyone was calling her sister a prostitute when she knew that that wasn't her relationship with her sister. At family or barbecues, she wouldn't say, "There's my sister, the prostitute." She was, she had a relationship with her. She was a real person. And escort work was something she did to make money, that she did every now and then, but it didn't necessarily define her. And so I thought, what must it be like to be that sister, sitting there now with the lights shining in her face, having to speak up for this lost family member? And my editor quite wisely said, well, why don't you interview all the families? And I brought them all together and did a cover story for New York Magazine, and that cascaded into the book.
That's amazing. And the book has now been made into a movie for Netflix that just came out in March
It's called Lost Girls, and it's an excellent movie.
I saw it, and it was very, very well done. It was awesome.
They took one plot. The book's sort of an ensemble book, with 1 million characters, not unlike Hidden Valley Road. But the Lost Girls movie takes one of those plots and puts that front and center, and focuses on the mother of one of the deceased women. She's played by Amy Ryan, and she does this amazing job of capturing this mother's vulnerability and her strength all at the same time. She's this real cage rattler of a personality who really gets the police's attention when nobody else can. And it's a terrific movie, and it really has themes and tone that are very much in tune with the book too.
So they took one out of that. So if people really enjoy the movie, they should definitely go and pick up your book, because it's multiple plots.
Exactly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, very cool. And what do you think's next for you? What's the next big book?
I think I'm going to take a nap. It's been a lot of work. It's very hard to find stories that are astonishing stories, but that are more than that aren't just rubbernecking and, hey, look at this crazy situation. It's much, much more satisfying to work on an astonishing story that also has something deep running under the surface. And so I wait for those moments before really committing.
Okay, so you like to, your writing is basically, and your passion's more towards telling true stories. And
Yeah, it's all nonfiction, and it always has to be about something more than just the story itself. Otherwise, I mean, it's fun to spin a yarn, I would do that. Maybe I would do something short, but to commit years to something, there really has to be a bigger issue going on too.
right. And I mean, you guys got to pick up, Lost Girls, pick up Hidden Valley Road, which just hit the shelves on April 7th. Uh, you're an amazing, amazing writer.
Thank
It's very, very admirable, and just how you were able to tell such a tragic story with such an empathetic tone, and really deliver a message that I feel is going to provide hope for all. So kudos and bravo to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Madison.
I mean, it's unbelievable. So, yeah. So we will wrap up, and I just thank you so much for sitting down with me and taking time out of your day to talk about this book. Such a great. It's nice to always get an in-depth, kind of behind-the-scenes look with the author. So that's exciting. And you guys, why don't you tell us before we go where they can find you? Do you have a website where they can kind of find all your information?
Yeah, my website is robertkolker.com. So Robert, KOLKER.com. And there you'll find ways to find out more about both of my books and a lot of my magazine stories as well.
And can will the book be available? Are most of the books in the bookstore?
Oh yeah, there are bookstores, Amazon, Apple Books, Kindle. They're everywhere.
Okay, awesome. So very cool. Well, Robert or Bob, Bob is more casual. His author name is Robert, but he's Bob now. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show. And you guys at home, thank you so much for listening to another episode of Next to Madison. We'll see you guys next time to find out who's next.
Hi, your host, Madison Malloy here. I just wanted to remind you guys to please follow the show on social media at Next to Madison. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the show, or you feel that you would be a great guest on the show and would love to be considered, please feel free to email me at nexttomadison@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on all podcast platforms. And I thank you again for listening.